without me. That's great. And one or two people still may be coming. We've got at least one person that's just popped in because the church is open. So I'm just going to explain that this is one of the meetings of the East Anglia branch of the Walsingham Historical Society. In normal times, we have meetings twice a year, and we haven't had one since this time in 2019. How did Debbie come in? Find a seat. So this is our sort of meeting back again, but it's an open meeting, and we've opened it to people in our local area and to everybody else. So people are here for different reasons. But it feels like a special occasion, particularly as we're at an interesting time in the life of Walsingham Methodist Church, which no longer has an active congregation, but we've kept it open, and the Central Norfolk Methodist Circuit is looking after it, and you're going to hear about that. And more than that, we are opening it up to the public on a regular basis, and we're working on ways of promoting ourselves and developing the heritage aspects and the spirituality aspects. But I must stop talking, else I'll have given everybody else to talk. I've got 3 hats on, I think. I've usually got different hats when I speak to the Walsingham Historical Society. One hat is I'm the Vice President of that society. One hat is I'm Minister of this church, as well as 8 others in this circuit. And one hat is that I'm giving the first of the talks. And my name's Jackie, and then I'll be followed by Norma. Norma, where are you? I'm here. Oh, you're up here, but you will come down when you're doing your talk. Yes, so then it'll be Norma next. And then it will be Glyn, who's also upstairs. And then Sam, who's here, and then finally we've got Sarah at the front. So hopefully that will all take about 50 minutes. Hopefully there'll be time for questions. Then, because it is a meeting sponsored by the Society, we've got to have a very short AGM, and we haven't had one for 2 years. But that part will only be short, and hopefully it will be interesting to everybody else, because we want to update our society in 1 or 2 ways, and there's 1 or 2 interesting things to say. And then we're having a tea, but we'll give instructions for the tea when we get there. So, at these meetings, the minister of the church often starts with a short time of devotions. Well, as I say, I'm the minister, and what I want to do is just say one prayer to start with, and then we'll have a hymn at the end of the talks. We had a special service here in September when we dedicated our new ramp and the facilities out there. And I went to one of John Wesley's prayers because I thought it befitted the occasion, and I thought I would do the same again. So in this little book that was my uncle's, he is still alive in a care home in Suffolk, but I have his little book of John Wesley prayers, and there's prayers for each day of the week, and this is for Saturday. Strengthen us, O Lord, to persevere with courage, that we may never be wanting in our fidelity to Thee. Convince us, blessed Jesus, into this firm judgment, and make our memories faithfully retain it. Whatever our senses say to deceive us, or the world to obscure so beauteous a truth, that Thyself alone art our chief good, and the sight of Thy glory, our supreme felicity. Amen. Amen. Welcome. to me, and I'm just going to paint a picture in around 5 or 6 minutes of the history of Little Walsingham as a village with its spiritual history. And that's a very grand task to try and do that in 5 or 6 minutes, but I'm giving it a go. And I'm using pictures from the Welcome Centre at the Anglican Shrine. That's a picture of the Anglican Shrine. The Welcome Centre, I mean. But first of all, I thought I'd quote from a book that I'm halfway through. It's called Pilgrimage, Journeys of Meaning by someone called Peter Stanford. And each chapter is about a different place of pilgrimage. And there's one chapter on Marian shrines. In other words, places dedicated to Mary, the Mother of Jesus. And he mentions in this book various places, but then he mentions Walsingham. A millennium ago, close to the east coast of England, at Walsingham in Norfolk, in 1061, Mary was reported to have appeared to a devout local noblewoman, Methodist de Faverges, and commanded her to build a replica of the Holy House of Nazareth, where the child Jesus had been raised. Then he says, this coincided with the rise of the cult of the Virgin Mary. In an organisation dominated by men in its upper clerical reaches, the figure of Mary as intercessor-in-chief on behalf of humankind in heaven had broad appeal in congregations where women were in the majority but had no official role. Lady Methodist set about doing as Mary had instructed her. With its replica holy house, its holy well where healing waters flowed, and its great abbey, Walsingham became one of the major Marian shrines of medieval Europe. So humble beginnings, and then it became one of the 4 major places of pilgrimage in the world in medieval times. But let's look at the Welcome Centre's little pictures. I hope you can see a general impression, if not the detail. But the story starts with the angel appearing to Mary in Nazareth, in a little house. And it's that house that Methodist was commanded to, or asked to build in a vision of Mary. Now, we don't know exactly when Methodist lived or when she built the holy house, but we think it was the end of the 11th century or the early 12th century. Certainly, by 1153, her son, Geoffrey de Faverges, had given land for a priory, and that land encompassed the holy house that his mother had built. And so the priory and the monks, as they developed their priory, incorporated a shrine that had this holy house inside. And of course, nothing is to be seen with that original house or indeed church, except one bit that I'll show you a photo of in a minute. But this is the site of it, and from archaeological excavation, it's known that that is the very likely site of the original house. And as the promotion and cult of the shrine developed, so pilgrims came in their thousands. And this is a picture of pilgrims coming on the top left-hand corner has a picture of a statue. And we know what that statue would have looked like because there is a seal that's attached to the act of supremacy that the priory would have signed. And on one side is a picture of this very big church, and on the other side is a picture of a statue of Mary and her child. And so there was an original statue that was in that original medieval shrine. That's a picture of what the church would have looked like, and the area with the Holy House is on the left of that picture. And here's what's left. I took this photo right back at the back of the site, and the pillar in the foreground is from the west part of the church, and the arch, which would have been part of the east part of the church. You can see that in the distance. And then that arch is at the top right of the picture, and you can see the little notice that says where the Holy House was. Well, 1538, actually, kings from Edward I to Henry VIII all went on pilgrimage to Walsingham. Henry VIII went on pilgrimage to Walsingham. But in 1538 it got destroyed along with all the other religious buildings in the country when Henry ordered that to happen. And the statue was destroyed, it was burnt. And the whole of that original Holy House would have been probably burnt to the ground. So hundreds of years then, 300 years, Walsingham just returned to being a little Norfolk village. And the first thing that happened that changed it again was a lady called Charlotte Boyd, was an Anglican who became Catholic, and she wanted to promote shrines, and she came to Walsingham and she saw the little slipper chapel, which is a mile out of the village, and where pilgrims had stopped on their way to the shrine here. And she acquired it and did it up and tried to give it to the Roman Catholic Church as a national shrine, but they didn't want it. The next thing that happened was that the Anglicans in the village, this chap, Father Hope Patton, came as vicar to the parish church, and he wanted to re-promote the Shrine of Mary. That's his tomb in the Anglican shrine buildings. And he had a new statue carved from the seal. And that's a picture of what it looked like. And pilgrims started coming again. I'll just stay with that because what then happened was the Catholic Church did take notice. They did make the Slipper Chapel the national shrine. They had a statue carved as well. So you had got the Roman Catholic shrine and the Anglican shrine, and there was some competition to start with, but now there is not, and they work together. And this is the current Holy House in the Anglican shrine. And that's another view, and the statue it's got robes around it, but it's all very elaborate and ornate. And I must leave it there. I can talk more to anybody about the history of the village later, but now Norma is on her way. Norma is the lady who edits and provides the material for the Journal of the Western Historical Society, and she also writes books, and she's just written one on the history of Walsingham. We haven't got it yet, but we're going to have it. And did you say it was your 20th?
I think so.
Yes. She's written 20 historical books. Okay, are you going to come here? No pictures.
allocated 12 to 15 minutes, so I'll be a bit longer than Jackie. John Wesley came here when he was 78 years old, and he wrote in his journal, "At 2 in the afternoon, I preached at Walsingham, a place famous for many generations. Afterwards, I walked over what is left of the famous abbey, the east end of which is still standing. We then went to the friary. The cloister and chapel whereof are almost entire. Had there been a grain of virtue or public spirit in Henry VIII, these noble buildings need not have run to ruin." I felt it was rather sad when I read that he makes no mention of the congregation that he saw here, and no mention of the place where he preached, but there we are. By the time Wesley came in 1781, there was already a Methodist society here. It had been going for 2 years, and so they were well organised to be able to receive the great John Wesley. In 1782, the congregation moved into a chapel, but they only stayed there for about 5 years and left there and began services in an empty house in the town. It's not really clear why they left the chapel, but perhaps the owner wanted to use it for some other reason. By 1793, they were ready to build their own chapel, and the stone laying was recorded in the chapel account book. 4 foundation stones were laid. One was laid by William Denton, the superintendent minister here, what was going to be here. The second one was by William Wetdrill, a long-term member of the congregation, and a farmer and an officer of excise. The third was laid by Lewis Minns, who was a miller in the town. And the fourth was laid by Martha Lambert, a shopkeeper. Well, that's quite amazing, really, to have a woman laying a foundation stone at this time. I mean, women were recorded as laying foundation stones for decades after, many decades after. So quite why she was chosen, it's impossible to say. But nevertheless, she laid one of the foundation stones. And the chapel was originally in the Lynn circuit, but the circuit became much too big. And so it was divided, and Walsingham was in the new circuit, and initially headed by Wells, and very quickly they made Walsingham the head of the circuit. And that too was interesting, because there were always many more members at Wells than there ever were at Walsingham. The chapel took just a year to build, and it was opened by Charles Boone, who was chairman of the district at that time, and he travelled up from Yarmouth to perform the ceremony. And the cost of the chapel was £750, which was a vast amount in those days. I don't really think there's much point in me galloping through a history of 2 centuries of Methodism in Walsingham. So I thought what I'd do is I'd point out some of the things that you can see, and then perhaps afterwards, when you're free to walk about, you can actually have a closer look. I think first one would comment on its position here. It's at the end of the High Street. It's close to the Friday market, and yet it's in a very discreet position. It's up this little entry here. And it was perhaps a feeling that it was better to be discreet than have a blatant position in the town where it might attract the attention of feeling passers-by, because we know that a lot of Methodist and non-conformist chapels in the early days did actually receive quite a lot of violence and opposition from people passing by or from the mob. So this was quite a nice, quiet position, and yet in the centre of town. When the chapel opened, it needed to have a licence. for religious worship. All buildings, whatever sort of buildings they were, needed a license in order to hold services there. And you can see outside, hanging up just opposite the front door, two of these licenses. One is for Great Walsingham and one is for here. And it was applied for by William Denton, the superintendent, and it's signed by the bishop's registrar. The bishop gave the licence, but in fact it was his registrar, and these licences are both signed by Richard Moss, who was the deputy registrar. We don't know who the architect was here. Perhaps there wasn't one, because in the chapel accounts, it lists a book of architecture. So maybe the trustees were deciding how they wanted the chapel built, or perhaps they'd ordered it so that a local builder perhaps could see how a chapel should look. And when you come inside, there are a number of things to note. It's very different from an Anglican church. There's no central aisle. Methodists don't process, so they don't need an aisle. There's a dominant pulpit here and a small communion area. In an Anglican church, you would have a much larger communion area because there the emphasis was on the sacraments. In a Methodist church, the emphasis was on the word, so that a pulpit was often raised in order to be able to address people in the gallery. And rather than being long, with the service going on at one end and the congregation stretching back in a relatively narrow building, here you've got everybody grouped around the pulpit because it was vital that people needed to be able to listen and hear what was going on. At the front of the church, there's no fixed font, but we do have a little font here. This was given in 1888 by a Mr. and Mrs. Watts in memory of their daughter. The pews upstairs are the original pews that were here in 1794. There were exactly the same pews downstairs, but there was a major restoration of the chapel in 1888, and the original pews were all taken out, and they were taken to a maltings down the road. I fear they must have been used for firewood, which is a terrible shame. Instead, these rather more heavy Victorian pews were put in, and you can see in the front row at least, there are little brass card holders all the way along. Now, obviously, there were more of these because the accounts show that 90 of them were bought. And people would put the cards with their name in the little holder, and for a quarter, they were able to book that seat. And they paid a very small amount of money to help the chapel finances, but that was their seat, and often they just rented quarter by quarter, and so they always sat in the same seat. The pulpit was also replaced. There was a platform with a pulpit on top originally, and when it was taken down in 1888, it was bought by George Back, who's got a little plaque over there, and he bought it for 5 shillings. I'm not quite sure what he would want to book it for, but he took it. The other thing was that the lighting in the church was all replaced, and some beautifully elegant duplex lamps were put in instead. And they lasted till 1938, until the Fairclough family, who also have a plaque over there, paid for the installation of electric light. But if you go in that little cupboard at the end there, there's one of these lovely duplex lights still in there. You can have a look, it's just up on the wall. And while you're in there, have a look out of the window, because you can see the friary ruins and how the chapel is on the edge of what was the priory land. And you can also walk up a little way up the road, you can see the priory ruins. They're really very impressive. There's, in 1901, the chapel, Every Dead, decided that they would start having a trial of collections in services. In normal Methodist services, collections weren't taken in services as they are now. And they used the little collecting boxes there next to the font to pass around. And it was clearly a success because by 1904, they were having collections in services once a month. Up there, you probably could see the brass plaque below the picture. That was put in to remember a man called Thomas Tops, who was a steward at the chapel for many years. And when he died, he left a small bequest to the chapel. But he also said that he wanted the residue of his estate, when it was sold, for the money to go to the chapel. And it raised £214. And so the congregation was very grateful, and they remembered him with the brass plaque. The organ came from the Primitive Methodist Chapel here. There was a very active Primitive Methodist Chapel here too. And when the Union of Methodism in 1932 occurred, the two congregations decided that they would join together here. And it was decided to get rid of the organ that was already here, which they sold for £15, and then spent another £35 bringing the organ from the Primitive Methodist Church. And somebody who saw it, an organ restorer in not so long ago, said that he thought that it dated from 1820 and that it was a particularly good organ and it was very worthwhile restoring. And one of the Fairclough family played the organ here in the 1980s. If you want to look at the Primitive Methodist Church, if you go across the Friday Market, you go a very short distance up a hill until you come to Coker's Hill. Mr. Coker was one of the first Primitive Methodists in Walsingham. And you very quickly come to a big green open space. And if you look on your right-hand side, halfway down, you can see the backs of the houses, and there's one there that's so obviously a chapel. And you can see the coloured glass on the edges of the windows. Unfortunately, the people who bought it or owned it have taken the front off. So from the front, there's just a very hideous rock stone front. You never guess it was a chapel from the front, you could see it around the back. I think that's my time.
This is a picture, which you can see looking back at there, from the 1930s, which we found a copy of in one of the cupboards. And it gives you an indication of what the membership was like in those days. And in fact, looking at the best we can tell, the membership was never vast. It was somewhere between about 12, around about a dozen members and about 18 adherents. But it ticked along, I could give you a lot more detail, but essentially it ticked along like that into the 1950s. And these are pictures of the Sunday school, and the building outside was the Sunday school, was now the Friars Choir, and this was the manse, and then the chapel keeper's house, which is next door there. So it's quite a nice bit of a stage, if you like, where everything was compact. So it ticked along into the 1950s with a Sunday school. In the early 2000s, what happened was this church was shared with the Catholics for some time, and they were rebuilding their church in the Friday Market, which is a lovely new church. They used to be here for their services. Just go back one bit here. This is a picture from 1987, not a very good one. You can see the place is full, and this place was completely refurbished in 1987. That's where the internal decorations and things date from. They used the money, I think, from the sale of Great Walsingham Methodist Church to refurbish this, and the cost, I think, was about 29,000, which in those days, in 1987, was a lot of money. Anyway, to go into more detail, the church ticked along up until about 2010 or thereabouts, holding services every week with a membership which was of the order of 10 to 12 people. But after about 2010, this is so often the way, the clock set in, and Rosemary can probably tell you more than I could about actual details, but people started to get old and then pass away, and they weren't replaced. Until finally, about 2015, 2016, there were two members really left here, and these were Tommy and Sylvia Seaman, and they really dedicated their lives to a large extent to looking after this building and holding services here. In fact, we've got a brass plaque to join the fair cloth and everybody else to go on the wall commemorating them in a few weeks' time. Unfortunately, they then both had serious health problems and finally died in 2019 and 2020. But they hadn't been able to do anything with the chapel since about 2016 or thereabouts. So we, myself and my wife Angela, really got to know Tommy and Sylvia quite well, and we could see that the place was deteriorating. They kept it in very good condition, and in fact, looking back over the years, even going back to sort of like 1860s, the trustees meetings, we were spending all the time talking about repainting windows and repairing this and doing other things, which still carries on today. It's a bit like they say about the Forth Bridge. You know, once you've stopped, you have to start again at the beginning. So we took over maintaining it, maintaining services if we could. We had a leak which was up there, and we couldn't actually find the cracks had been there for many years, and that's another story altogether. But we had a leak, and we couldn't determine where it's coming from, so we got a drone and had a look at the roof. We've got some wonderful pictures. You can see the drone on the top there, the white thing. We've got some wonderful pictures of Walsingham from the air, but it let us look at all the tiles, all the joints, and everything else. And we found out where the leak was coming from, which is that little thing there. Got it redone, but to do it, you know, to build it this size, it needs scaffolding, and that costs. So again, it's the sort of work we do. Here, the steps were a mess at the front. As you come up with them today, you'll have noticed they're looking really good. We've had those done as well recently. This is the state the windows it got into in 2018 or thereabouts, and we kept getting cracks appearing when the wind blew, and you can see what they were looking like. Anyway, we started off, myself and my wife started off redoing the windows, repainting them, reputting them, but finally we found a man called Dan who could do the upstairs ones for us, and you can see they're looking vastly, vastly better. And he also repainted the inside of the windows here as well. We had a school party come in, and inadvertently damaged our plaster. But you can see we had to get into the plaster work done. But the interesting thing here, if you look at that picture there, you can see there's a little bit of red hair sticking out the side of it. And that comes from, I think, a Suffolk red pole or something like that, cow, which they use to actually strengthen the hair from them, to actually strengthen the plaster work from the plaster and that plastering. But you've got to get specialist plasterers in. The seat cushions we're sitting on, one of our local landowners came in and didn't like the look of our old seats, which were there, and very kindly donated some new ones. So you're sitting on some brand new pew cushions. We had a ramp for services which wasn't very good, which is on the left-hand side, and there were various plans over the years to do something about it. Finally, we've got this finished. It took a long time because of the pandemic, but essentially we raised the money, and we've now got a ramp going into the side, and we've redone the toilet and the kitchen. And as of the day before yesterday, we've got the top of the drive tarmac as well, which is looking a lot more presentable. So altogether, you know, we're looking a lot better than we were before. This is the fact. This is the dedication from a few weeks ago. What do we do here? Well, we have schools go round. This is some school visits, learning about Methodism. The Norfolk Cycle Line, top side. We've had vice presidential visits. This is the Marian Ecumenical Fellowship, who looking good, and we intend to keep it that way if we possibly can. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. The next up is Sam. Yes. Since April 2019, yes, Sam has been employed by the circuit, funded by the connection and now by the district, to work in both Blakeney and here at Walsingham. She's going to tell us about that. That's her by the Walsingham Pub.
Goodness. I've enjoyed everybody else's talk so much that I almost forgot that I had to say something as well. So, I am here, as Jackie said, as a lay pioneer. Started in 2019 as part of a 5-year project called Replanting Rural. Working here in Walsingham and with the chapel in Blakeney. So we had 2 rural churches, and our remit is to explore how and where we sit in the landscape of our communities. It is a privilege to work with Jackie as my colleague and as such part of such a wonderful team with Lynn and Anglia. I've never had a job where I felt so much joy and laughter, I have to say. And together we have 5 years to journey, to test, and to reflect as a team as to where and what God is up to. As a pioneer, I often describe my calling, my purpose in a place, is to find where God already is in a community and to meet the community there. And that means that pioneering is always contextual. The pioneering work I do at Blakeney is very different to the work I do here at Walsingham. I sit on the Methodist Pioneering Pathways, which is a community of practice of lots of different pioneers from all across the connection. And we're all in very different contexts. And here in Walsingham, after much prayer and consideration, listening to the community, speaking with one another, and copious amounts of tea and cake, Jackie and I discerned that our purpose here, our journey here at Walsingham, is to focus on Methodist heritage, on spirituality, and particularly with a flavour of pilgrimage, and some education to go in with that heritage. As Lynn said, we have the school visits come where we have hundreds of 15 and 16-year-olds come to Walsingham as part of their GCSE studies, and they come to compare and contrast the different places of worship, our architecture, and what that tells us about the founding principles of each strand of Christianity. We've also been having our services, as Glenn explained, and we've been opening twice a week. And that really has been wonderful. We've had people wander in who have enjoyed a trip on the Wells to Walsingham mini railway, who had no idea that there were so many churches in Walsingham. And they come in and say, goodness me, what's with all the churches? We've had people who come in and say, gosh, this is a lovely building, but I'm an atheist, don't you know? At which point generally the kettle goes on. And yesterday, at 4 o'clock, the sun was streaming through these 2 windows onto the pews below. And I was just on the verge of going and getting the sign in. We close at 4 on some time, and then was very grateful afterwards. And then I must tell you, she said, "Oh, we've been trying to order an Uber." I said, "Well, you won't find one in Walsingham." So instead, I managed to order her a taxi. To be a pioneer in a place of heritage, I think is quite unusual. I haven't come across many pioneers, or any, yet, who work with a foot in two seemingly disparate places. But I had a visitor last week, our Methodist Pioneer Pathways local coordinator, Nigel Pimlock, popped in. And he'd been to see some other people. And he said, "Oh, I'll show you around." I said, "Do you think it's strange, Nigel, that I'm a pioneer in this place of heritage and history?" He said, No. He said, "You know what they say?" He said, "They say that you learn from the past, you plan for the future, and you live in the moment." And I feel that that's where we are and what we're doing here. And I can think of no better team or place to do that in. I'll just leave you with some advice that was given by a guy called Michael Moyer, and he's written lots of church planting books. And he said, regardless of whatever model of church planting you follow, or whatever percentages you're looking at with your pioneering, the most important thing to remember is that whatever you do it generously.
Thank you, Sam. And now, last but not least, we've got Sarah, who is a member of Western Historical Society and lives in Down Market, but is a friend of Walsingham in various ways, and a promoter, haven't you been, of the place, and is going to talk to us about pilgrimage in general. You don't live in Down Market.
I
Right.
live
You live
near
near
there.
there.
Yes, so Jackie's already given me an introduction. So my name's Sarah Friswell, and as you've heard, I'm a member of the Western Historical Society Committee. But I'm also the chair of trustees of this place. So I'm hoping you all know where it is. Epworth Old Rectory, yes. So the place where John and Charles and several other Wesleys were born. And I currently am the chair of trustees there, so that's a great privilege to welcome people to that place of Methodist pilgrimage. And as my day job, I work at the cathedral in Bury St Edmunds. My job title at the minute, I say at the minute because it's changed quite a few times, is Visitor Experience Manager. But I have in the past had the job title of Visitor and Pilgrimage Manager for the cathedral. So you get a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from, and I've had a nice chat with my partner here, Mary, who's come in the car with me from Down Market. We've been sharing stories of, in fact, our lives have had similar paths, and we didn't know it until we came on our journey today. And so more of the importance of journey in a moment. But pilgrimage is something that I'm absolutely passionate about. So I wonder, looking at all of you now, if I say the word pilgrimage to you, what you think of? Do you think of the Canterbury Tales, as you can see on that picture there? Do you think of medieval pilgrims going to shrines as a penance, because they were told they had to go, otherwise they wouldn't go to heaven? Or perhaps pilgrimage to you is one of the modern TV programmes. There's been plenty of them on recently, and the picture that you can see on the screen now is from a programme that was about pilgrimage to Istanbul, and often you get celebrities on these programmes who have these life-changing revelations whilst they're on these pilgrimages. It's certainly a popular word at the moment, and also it's a popular activity. Some of you will know that one of the great shrines, pilgrimage shrines in the world, is at Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. It's known as the Camino, the way to the Shrine of St. James, and literally thousands of people walk various routes from different countries to that shrine in northern Spain. And when they get there, they get a certificate to say that they have completed the Camino. And that is becoming increasingly popular, apart from the pandemic, up to the present day. So pilgrimage is a word that we find in both sacred and secular worlds. But is it a Methodist word? Well, I've got a few things to show you today. I have this book on my bookshelves, if you can't quite see it. It's called The Methodist Pilgrim. It's written by a gentleman called Frank Baker in 1951, and basically it's a travel journal. So it takes you around what he believes to be the places of pilgrimage for Methodists. And I'm very pleased to say that the first place is Epworth, home of the Wesleys, then goes on to Oxford, London, which is described as the general headquarters of Methodism, Bristol and the West, Birmingham, Newcastle. So there we go. If you want to know more, have a look in my Methodist pilgrimage book. But I just want to very briefly talk about my own personal experience as of what I believe to be a Methodist pilgrimage experience. And I'm thinking I might be going to surprise Jackie now, because the reason I had this particular experience was due to her father, Reverend Bill Horton, who I used to worship at the same church as him in Bury St Edmunds. And a few years ago now, 2003, it was the 125th anniversary of the chapel in Bury St Edmunds. And so Bill's decided that all of us as a congregation were going to go on a trip to London so we could learn about our Methodist roots. And he took us off to Wesley's Chapel, and we had a lovely time there. We had a little service there, which was very, very nice. And then we walked as a group to Aldersgate Street, and we stood on the spot, we've got the plaque there, of the heartwarming experience of John Wesley. And then, in true Methodist style, we struck up a hymn. We were just standing in the street, and we started singing. I can't actually remember, but I'm hoping it was over 1,000 times to sing. It might not have been. But as we were singing, a gentleman leant out of his upstairs bedroom window to say, "What on earth are you not doing out there?" And somehow, and yeah, it was a God moment in my opinion, all of a sudden, I was aged, well, whenever I was aged then, suddenly had this revelation of how important my faith was to me, and how it was totally and utterly acceptable to stand in a street and sing and proclaim my faith. And suddenly, I'd never really known much about the history of the Methodist Church, but suddenly it all made sense to me. And so that really, to me, felt like a pilgrimage experience of my own. And because the Methodists can claim to have some links with the word pilgrimage anyway, many of you will know that a scallop shell is often the symbol of pilgrimage. This is also the symbol of St. James. So where I work at the cathedral in Bury St Edmunds, it's dedicated to St. James. We have scallop shells all over the place, carved into the architecture. But I'll just hold up, let me get it the right way around, this, and then I brought something else to show you. I'll have to move out so you can see it properly, for those of you upstairs. Yeah. So this belonged to my father. He had it on his car. My father was the district MAYC president for York and Hull district back in the day, and MAYC used to have a scallop shell as their badge. I don't know if that had anything to do with pilgrimage. Perhaps some of you would like to tell me afterwards. But some of you, I'm sure, some of you got little scallop shell badges? Yeah, I've got some of those at home as well. So we've got a little bit of pilgrimage somewhere in our Methodist DNA. But over the years, as I've been involved in pilgrimage, both through my work at an Anglican cathedral and my own personal experience, I have really reflected on what I think it is. And I just want to offer this to you today as we conclude our talks this afternoon. Pilgrimage to me is about setting out on a journey. It's about going somewhere. Now, you don't have to physically walk somewhere, but often that is what it involves. But the important thing about a pilgrimage is that you consciously leave things behind. It might be something that's troubling you, or it might be a physical place. But it's about setting out, and it's about being open-minded about what might happen next. Really importantly, it's about companions on the road, who we travel with, and I just mentioned about the nice conversation I had with Mary on the way here. So that's part of a pilgrimage. It's the people you walk with, the people you journey with. There may be people you know, there may be total strangers, because we all learn from one another all the time. Destination, where you're heading, is really important. The picture on the top there, the top right, no, the top left, sorry, that's, some of you will recognise Jill Baker. And that was on a pilgrimage in London, where we were thinking about Susanna Wesley. And so we made a pilgrimage to her grave, which is in Walsingham Fields. So our destination is important. And of course, we're talking today, and we're here today in Walsingham Chapel. This is a pilgrimage destination. Now, what I'm not suggesting is we turn places into sort of sanctuaries and shrines. Our friends of other denominations may do that. I don't think that's a very Methodist way of behaving. But places are important to us. You will all have places that are important in your Methodist journey as well. And then finally, the final bit of a pilgrimage is actually about going home again. What has changed about you? What new understandings have you got? What have you learned? That you then take back to your home, and then you continue to live that out in your local setting. So I think as Methodists, we really need to adopt the language of pilgrimage. I think it's important to us. We have a great example, of course, in John Wesley. He was a great person for going on journeys. How many thousand miles did he travel? More than any of us are likely to, I think. And he did it all on a horse. So journey and movement was important to the founder of the Methodist Church. And of course, even today within our understanding of our Methodist Church, our ministers are itinerant, so we have that sense of movement in our denomination. And because it doesn't, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean just about journey, it's not just about a physical journey. As we all know, within our churches, our faith grows and deepens through our local fellowships, through our Bible studies, through our house groups. So in a way, I see almost the whole of life, the Christian journey is a form of pilgrimage. The Methodist Church has done quite a bit of thinking about this. Jill Baker was on an earlier picture. She headed up a conference about it, which was held at Cliff College a few years ago. And if you're interested in finding out more, that website there, you might not be able to see it, but I can give you it later. If you go onto the Methodist Church website, there's quite a lot about pilgrimage from a Methodist understanding already on there. But anyway, just to conclude, today we're having these talks here in this fantastic historic setting. This chapel is in the middle of a place that buzzes with pilgrims because they're coming to the Anglican shrine, they're coming to the Catholic shrine. It is a place of pilgrimage, the whole place is. But I think the ones of us who are here today, and certainly some of us closely involved here, we think that this place has its rightful place as a place of pilgrimage. It's historic, but the power of the story is how it transforms people's lives today. And Sam just gave some brilliant examples of that. So it's a living, working example of pilgrimage. And I hope that you will all be part of that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, because we've all given our own personal, woven our personal stories in, I think, to the story of the village and the story of what's gone on here in the past and is going on here now, and what's going on all over the country in terms of pilgrimage. We certainly want to develop, we've got a good team here now, and we certainly want to develop this place as a destination for pilgrimage. If you would like to keep up to date with developments the pews, just leave us your email address, and there were 3 baskets I put on the tables outside. The middle basket can be for completed ones of these. If you've already had an email from the Friends newsletter, then you don't need to do it. But if anybody else would like to receive them, that's what you do. As we conclude this part of the afternoon, we're going to sing a hymn. I wrote it a few weeks ago when we had that service with the dedication of the ramp and the facilities. And I was very presumptuous inviting him at all. And it setting it to the tune about Can It Be. But when it came into my head that we needed a hymn about Walsingham and Walsingham Wesleyan Methodist Church, that's the tune that came into my head. So I hope you've all got sight of it. Has anybody not? Most of you got one of them. Yeah. There are some upstairs. Yeah. Pippa is on the organ, and she's used to play the organ, so this week she used to play this organ. So you'll be able to hear the organ as well as we sing it. And if you're happy to stand, and if you want to stay seated, or that's appropriate for you, then stay seated. Thank you.